Welcome back. All right, so today I want to do a misery index. I have not done a misery index since I think it's just December of last year was the last time I did one. So every time I do one, they're going to be a little different because I may use a different point system. I may use a different indicator for how I feel about the whole misery side of things. So the way this works is simple. Teams that have had tremendous success since 2013, so this will measure from 2013 until now, towards the bottom. Teams that have had a ton of success will be there, while the teams that haven't will be up here. Also, I factored in how many seasons has it been since their last Stanley Cup. Also, how many seasons has it been without a Stanley Cup period, meaning teams that have never won one for each season that they've been in the league. There were a certain number of points given out. And I looked at the 1 through 32 on this and I went, yeah, that seems about accurate. So I'm wearing Tampa Bay for a very simple reason. The Tampa Bay Lightning, who have won the Stanley Cup twice over the last 3 years, are number 32. There is no reason for Tampa Bay fans at this point to feel any sort of misery about their organization, which is different than it would have been, say, in, 2019. There would have been some misery then. But yeah, I mean, while Tampa Bay over the last 10 years has had a couple seasons there, they missed the playoffs, and definitely a setback in 2010. When all the math was done, they were the team that had the least amount of points. Then you get to number 31, a team that's also won 2 Stanley Cups, Pittsburgh. And so Stanley Cups basically help you deduct points. So you may build up the misery points, but you win a Stanley Cup, points get deducted. And that's why Pittsburgh and Tampa are at the bottom. Now, for Pittsburgh, of course, recent years, there's been problems getting out of the first round. But the reality is still, this is an organization that won in 2016, 2017, also won in 2009. They're doing all right. And even if they don't win the Stanley Cup this year, next year when I do a misery index, they'll still do all right. They'll still be just fine. So bottom 2, I don't expect a lot of debate. At number 30, the Chicago Blackhawks. They also have 2 Stanley Cups during this period in time, one in 2013 and 2015. So that would mean that next year, 2013 would come off the books if I again use a 10-year time period, and Chicago would move up in the misery index because we're not expecting them to be in the playoffs this year either. So the deducted points for that Stanley Cup come off, and then points for missing the playoffs go on, and Chicago suddenly starts to move up the charts relatively quickly. But that's kind of how I designed this to work. Number 29, a team that also won a Stanley Cup, the St. Louis Blues. So St. Louis won it in 2019, and there's no reason to have them much higher than that because, again, they won the Stanley Cup in 2019. Must have been nice. As a Boston fan, I have to say it would have been nice to see them win it again. However, it was fun to watch St. Louis win their first ever Stanley Cup. And in that vein, that same way of thinking, the 2018 Stanley Cup champions come in 28th, the Washington Capitals. Capitals finally broke through in 2018. Stanley Cup was theirs. So you've got a Stanley Cup. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Stanley Cups in the last 10 years are already on the board. So that's an indicator, again, that I think the system I came up with works pretty well. Is it perfect? Probably not, but I think it works pretty well. Number 27, one of the newer teams in the league, Vegas. For Vegas, I'm going to be honest, when everything was said and done, they ended up with a 0. They weren't a positive or a negative. Missing the playoffs definitely means there's a little more misery there this past year. But again, for Vegas, it's a 5-year history. They could only build up so many points because they've been in the league 5 years. And I mean, I'm sure that if we reach the 10-year mark and they still haven't won a Stanley Cup, they'll be higher on the misery index. But at this point, they haven't had the suffering that teams, especially in this row, have had. Number 26, a team with playoff success, but not a Stanley Cup for a while. And that's Boston. Their last Stanley Cup being in 2011. They've reached a Stanley Cup final in 2019. They've been pretty good at getting out of the first round. They haven't had a lot of seasons where they're outside of the playoffs either. So Boston ends up 26th overall, which is odd because there's no Stanley Cup for these two teams. So where are the Stanley Cup champions at? Well, the first of them is Colorado. They're at 25. So why wouldn't the most recent Stanley Cup champion be at 32? And I know that question will get asked, because this is for the last 10 years. And so the index for the last 10 years would tell you they've had years they've missed the playoffs. They've had miserable seasons along the way too. and getting out of the second round was a challenge. So while that Stanley Cup absolutely drops them way down from where they would have been, let me just take a quick look at the board there. Yeah, they would have been in the top 20 until that Stanley Cup win, and that drops them down to 25. So yeah, Colorado, a Stanley Cup win absolutely drops them into the bottom row, and if they win another one, they'll be right down here. Right? They win another Stanley Cup, they will be right down in this range. So if they win it next year, next misery index, they'll be right down at the bottom. Number 24, they've only got one season in the NHL. So for Seattle, 24 I think is a good spot for them. It was not a fantastic season for Seattle. It was a season that they're looking to better this year. I am expecting them to probably miss the playoffs again, so they'll start moving up. And again, it feels like this shows that the point system I have, again, not perfect, but I think it worked pretty well. For Seattle, we'll see whether or not they make the playoffs and whether or not they're going to start making that move into contention over the next few years. But it's not expected this year. So at number 23, the other Stanley Cup, which is LA's. So LA won the cup in 2014, right? The thing with LA is, not long after that Stanley Cup win, the misery began. And they've had a lot of seasons outside of the playoffs. They've had struggles. They did make the playoffs this year, lost in the first round. And so LA ends up at 23rd. So that is the highest that any team that has won a Stanley Cup in the last 10 years ends up on the index. And so the debate can be had about whether or not LA should be higher than Boston, Vegas, or Seattle because of the fact they won the cup in 2014. But again, it's over that 10-year period. There have been some trying times for the LA Kings. So at number 22, I was mildly surprised by this one, and yet it's just a mild surprise that the New York Rangers are 22nd, and here's why. They've had some good runs. They've had some good runs from 2013 until now, and while they did miss the playoffs a few times along the way too, really in general, when they make the playoffs, they're really quite good. And the expectation is for that to continue this year. Maybe Shesterkin's the one to get them to their first Stanley Cup since '94. But either way, the New York Rangers at number 22 on the board. Number 21, Nashville. No Stanley Cups in their history. They've got a Stanley Cup final run in 2017. They've been a pretty good playoff team mostly throughout that time. Underrated for sure at points, especially going into that 2017 run. But yeah, so Nashville ends up 21st on the overall ranking. But again, no Stanley Cups in their history, as there isn't for the San Jose Sharks, who end up 20th. Now, the expectation is that they will be outside the playoffs this year as well. 2013 had come off the board. 2023 goes on instead. San Jose probably moves up, right? At the very least, there'll be another year without a Stanley Cup. That is something that I factor into this as well. So yeah, for San Jose 20th, a team that was very good, very remarkably consistent in making the playoffs, that has had a challenge doing so in recent seasons. Number 19, Montreal. Montreal Canadiens, of course, the Stanley Cup final run not too long ago, being last year and all. But for the Montreal Canadiens, it has been a bit of a trial overall since 1993. Of course, 1995-96 comes to mind immediately when I say that, because that was the whole Patrick Roy exit and everything. But while Montreal's had some decent runs here and there, the reality is this is a team that looks like that's going into a pretty major rebuild. And so the expectation, I would think, would be they'll end up moving up this board rather than down in the near future. Number 18, also a team that made the Stanley Cup final, Dallas. So this is an interesting point of view as well. Finalists. All teams that have reached Stanley Cup finals in the last 10 years. Also, Boston was a finalist. Vegas was a finalist. So that is something that I used in my calculations to say a Stanley Cup final run definitely takes some misery off. Now, losing in the Stanley Cup final is not fun, but at the very least, you've got a team that went all the way to the Stanley Cup final. They were one of the last two teams left standing. And for Dallas, that final run definitely helped them. They do miss the playoffs regularly outside of that as well, too. So there is a feast or famine side of things with the Dallas Stars. At number 17, and this is where Minnesota fans say, wait, what? Here's the problem. For Minnesota, the misery has to be for the Minnesota Wild. I cannot incorporate the numbers for the Minnesota North Stars. As much as fans of Minnesota are going to say, we went through a lot with the North Stars, and they did. But this is also for the last 10 years. So the Stanley Cup drought is taken into account. I did not take into account that the Stanley Cup drought with the Minnesota North Stars would tack on a lot more points, meaning they'd move up the board a lot. But I thought, then you've got to, with the Winnipeg Jets, I'd have to look at, the Winnipeg Jets in the NHL and all that fun stuff. So I'm going to leave this as the Minnesota Wild at 17. But yeah, this is a team that definitely needs to go on a run. They haven't been on a nice long run since 2003, and they've never reached the Stanley Cup final. At 16th on the board, Anaheim. So Anaheim in the top half. Of course, this is going to be due to recent seasons where they've missed the playoffs. That is expected to continue as well. So Anaheim will likely move up the board the next time I do a misery index. But 2013 and years around it, Anaheim was pretty good. Anaheim was a pretty good team. They had some decent runs in there as well. Not a run back to the final or anything, and they haven't won the Stanley Cup since their lone Cup victory in 2007. But it does feel like Anaheim's trending in the right direction, just probably not playoffs this coming season. Number 15, the New York Islanders. Been a long time since the Islanders won a Stanley Cup, but they had a couple of conference final runs in there, and so that helps the Islanders stay out of the top row. The New York Islanders, I know there's been times I've done misery indexes where they're much higher than 15th. So, and I'm talking about like years ago, probably before the conference final runs, right? So yeah, New York Islanders in what I put together today end up 15th. At 14th, the team that hasn't won the Cup since 2006, and that's the Carolina Hurricanes. So to the Carolina Hurricanes' benefit, they've had some good runs, but they've also had some playoff misses. They've had first-round losses as well. So Carolina, a team looking for a Stanley Cup, may end up winning the Stanley Cup. The Hockey News is picking them to win the Stanley Cup this year. However, an actual Stanley Cup win is not that simple. And fans of almost any team can tell you, teams that have won the Stanley Cup, like, how long did it take the Caps? How long did it take the Blues? How many years was it between Stanley Cups for Chicago? It was, 63 through to 2010. Pittsburgh didn't go through that kind of a drought. But for Tampa, it was 16 years in between Stanley Cups as well. So for Carolina, they're now going to be looking at 17 years since their last Stanley Cup. Maybe this is the year where that drought comes to an end. Number 13, the Winnipeg Jets. So for the Jets, they've had some playoff misses in there. They haven't been on a really long run outside of 2018 when they got knocked out by Vegas in the conference final. So yeah, for the Jets, they're in the top half of the board. They're not in the top row of misery, but it's been a while, and it sort of feels like with things in Winnipeg, it could go either way. Maybe taking the captaincy away from Blake Wheeler shows that Bonus has control of the room, and maybe things settle out. Maybe they get worse, right? We'll see what happens this year, but they're going to be fascinating to watch. Number 12, Columbus. Columbus, of course, did knock out Tampa Bay in 2019, but outside of that, and of course knocking out Toronto in the play-in round in 2020, there really hasn't been a lot of joy in Columbus. And of course, that 2019 win over Tampa, well, then Tampa took them out in 2020. So it kind of cancels out, but it was a much bigger shock when Columbus knocked out the Tampa Bay Lightning. So for Columbus, a team looking for a run, they pick up Johnny Gaudreau. Maybe this year they get back into the playoff hunt. I'm picking them to make the playoffs. We'll see whether or not that happens. Number 11, Detroit. It really doesn't feel like it was that long ago that Detroit was a Stanley Cup champion, but I'm old, so in reality, it's been a while now, right? It's been 14 years. It's going to be 15 this year. But it feels like they've built well. Good job being done by Steve Yzerman. And so Detroit, while they've moved up the board to the top, almost the top 10, and they may make the top 10 when I do this next year, but it's going to get better, right? Number 10, Calgary. So it's an alarming number of Canadian teams that are still yet to come because Canada hasn't won a cup since 93, so that's going to happen. For Calgary, a team that's won their division in 2019 and 2022, I did not take a division win into any kind of consideration because winning a division may feel great at the time, but then if you lose in the first round, did you really win the division? Does it feel like you won the division? And the answer is not really. 2022, of course, they got out of the first round. 2019, they did not. but they won the West, and it didn't help them. So I did not take that into consideration if you won your division. But yeah, so Calgary ends up top 10. They have been a team that can be really good one year, miss the playoffs the next, can be inconsistent, and so they end up in the top 10. Number 9, not quite in the top row, but close. Their brethren from Edmonton. Yeah, so Edmonton being top 10 mildly surprised me, but I mean, look at the run they went on this year, and as great as that was, it's been a while since the Edmonton Oilers were that relevant. I'm looking back to 06. So there is some expectation for the Oilers this year that this could be the season that maybe they get back to the Stanley Cup final. Could they win it if they get there? It'll be fascinating to watch Connor McDavid if they get that far. He did very well in the playoffs this year, and while Edmonton had a really good playoff run, I didn't view that as necessarily something that should cause a bunch of points to get taken off for them in the misery index. So, of course, if the Oilers win their Stanley Cup, how many points? Yeah, if they win the Stanley Cup, they'll end up right down in this row. So, there you go. But yeah, so the Oilers, it's been a while. Number 8, not a Stanley Cup for this franchise as of yet, and that's Ottawa. And this is where the fact that I counted seasons for the Ottawa Senators, this franchise, rather than counting the Ottawa Senators back to the previous Ottawa Senators franchise, which actually moved to St. Louis, became the Eagles. They might be number 1 if I had factored in that cup drought. But for Ottawa, it's been a rough time. Absolutely. This would tell you it's been a while since they were in the playoffs. However, it feels like things are ready to turn the corner. Whether it's this season or the following one, it definitely feels like Ottawa's built up a pretty darn good team. I think they've done it the right way, and we'll see whether or not that's true this year. But for right now, they're number 8 on the board. Number 7, Florida. It has been a while since Florida got out of the second round, looking at 1996, but it had been since 1996, since their last time out of the first round until this year. So Florida's making gains. There's definitely the possibility. There are those who are picking Florida to win a Stanley Cup this year, and we'll see whether or not that happens. Not very many. They are not a favorite. Colorado's the favorite to repeat, but Florida's got some votes, and maybe this is their time. But it had been a long time since they made it to the first round. And remember, this goes back to 2013. They were irrelevant for a long portion of that time. So they're number 7. Number 6. So for Toronto, they're making the playoffs, right? They're making the playoffs the last 6 years. They also have lost in the first round for the last 6 years. So that, to me, it adds to misery, not the same rate that missing the playoffs does, but I mean, it really is not something that Toronto fans are looking at right now and saying, hey, we've made the playoffs 6 years in a row. We're really happy. No, they want to get out of that first round. They want to be really and truly Stanley Cup contenders, and you have to have that victory. You have to at least get out of the first round in the playoffs, and Toronto has not done that in quite some time, looking back to 2004 for that. And of course, if you're looking at Cup drought, Stanley Cup final drought, whatever you want to talk about here, it's the Sahara Desert with Toronto, and that's a problem. So Toronto, top row, they're going to have to win a round. They're going to have to do something if they want to get out of the top row. Number 5, Philadelphia. Now, if we were just talking about this past season, Philadelphia is probably number 1. And I say that even though Montreal had a disastrous season, but it feels like Philadelphia's was worse. It feels like Philadelphia's last 12 months were just a nightmare. However, over the last 10 years, they've had some good seasons in there. They've had some decent playoff appearances here and there, but not consistent, right? So for Philadelphia, number 5 on the board. Again, if you're a Flyers fan, it may feel like, why aren't we number 1? Because of the 4 teams ahead of you. At number 4, New Jersey. So New Jersey, a long while since New Jersey was really and truly not just in a playoff spot, but felt like they had some contention there. And even in 2012, when they went on that run to the final, that really felt like it was a momentum shift towards them, and it was a run to try to get one more cup ring for Marty Brodeur. Because New Jersey going to the 2012 playoffs, I don't really know of anybody who was picking to go to the final. It's possible somebody was, but it was just a bit of a surprise. So for the New Jersey Devils, they really need to build themselves up right. I think they have. Whether it's this season to make the playoffs or not, we'll see. But for the last 10 years. I have no problem with them being top 4. So we know who the top 3 are, don't we? Is it a surprise that these are the top 3? Not really. Is Vancouver being number 3 a surprise? Not really. This is part of the reason why when I hear Canuck fans talking about, well, they should just sell off the core guys and just start over. They need to do a rebuild. You're not number 3 on the board because you need to go into a rebuild. You're number 3 on the board because this team has had miserable experience after miserable experience from 2013 through until now. And they made the playoffs in 2015. They didn't get out of the first round. They made the playoffs in 2013, didn't win a game. 2020, they get into the playoffs, and they got into the second round. However, that's where the happiness ends. And for Vancouver fans, it's been a long time. So hopefully this core is able to turn it around, at least get them into the playoffs, something, because I feel like the market really desperately needs. I mean, saying a winner makes it sound like a contending team, but a playoff team would be a nice place to start, right? You got to start somewhere. You got to. Number 2, Arizona. The Coyotes, of course, going into the new building and all that, and all of the fun that surrounds that. The Coyotes end up at number 2. A ton of points for the Coyotes, but 2020, they did make the playoffs. 2020, they did knock out Nashville in the play-in round. And that play-in round helps to keep them at number 2 rather than being number 1. Because they played important games. Arizona, outside the playoffs, though, outside of that. The thing is, there's one team that has not been in the playoffs for so long. And it's Buffalo. So again, when I put this list together on one board, and then I put 1 through 32 on this board, I looked at it and I went, yeah, that seems to be pretty indicative over the last 10 years. When you're looking at playoff droughts versus playoff success, and you're looking at overall misery, I think that's pretty accurate. So again, it's over the last 10 years. It's not this year. It's not, more leaning towards one year than the other. So I didn't give more points for 2020 than I gave for 2013, more points for 2022 than 2016. It's the same for every season. I think it comes out pretty accurately. So Buffalo's number 1. There you go. Buffalo and Arizona's number 2. So they were number 2 on that power ranking video I did earlier today because I just went alphabetical. And they're number 2 on the misery index. So there you go. I guess for fans of teams in the top row, you could pretend it's a power ranking, but then Leaf fans would say you've got us behind Philadelphia, New Jersey, Vancouver, Arizona, and Buffalo in a power ranking. You've chosen violence on this day. My answer to that would be no. Because again, it's not a power ranking, it's a misery index. But by all means, screenshot this and share it and go, I think THG's lost his mind. These are his power rankings. Because I would have to lose my mind in order for these to be the power rankings. There you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. If you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. And again, there's no opinion in any of this. It's just math. It's just straight up assigning point totals to certain things that take place and just going with it that way and saying, all right. And I keep it simple. I used to make it really complicated and there were a lot of different numbers, but in the end, it always seemed to end up with the same teams at the top, whether I went with a really complicated formula versus a really simple one. So go with the simple one. It still took me over an hour to get all the math done and all figured out. So there you go. Let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. And hey, Buffalo's number 1 at something. There you go. And I can only say that because Vancouver's number 3 at something. So I'm right there. That expansion year, it's been bad luck for those teams. Maybe both Buffalo and Vancouver should dissolve and reform their franchise and pretend they're expansion teams. Just keep all the players. I don't know. I'm just thinking outside the box. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.